been a vegan since 1979, and I first tried to get involved with the animal rights movement, the animal advocacy movement, in 1977. Trying to join the Hunt Saboteurs then. There was nothing much going on. I was in a place called Scunthorpe, which is a little bit out of the way in England. And so it wasn't until 1979, by which time I was in Essex, that things kind of took off for me, and I started going sabbing. So I got pretty experienced at as being a Hunt Saboteur, and I was also quite lucky in the sense that there was a lot of supportive people around there, so I kind of went vegan within 3 months. So I'm always quite thankful in a way that I didn't go through the vegetarian phase. I know that a lot of people, get stuck in that, if you like, and you see a lot of people saying, well, if only I'd have gone vegan earlier, or this kind of thing, So I was quite lucky in that sense. By the time we get to the 1980s, which is here, I'm in Liverpool at this time, so I was a member of the Merseyside Sea Shepherd crew, and Sea Shepherd in Europe was quite big at the time, under the leadership of a guy called David McCall, who sadly died now. And what happened was the Scottish office, they decided to kill some seals, and normally they would kill 2,000 a year, and they decided to kill 6,000. And so Greenpeace arrived with the Rainbow Warrior, before it was sunk by the French. and they arrived, and the Hunt Saboteurs arrived, and then the Scottish office backed down, and then Greenpeace, kind of got the champagne out and the corks and everything, and sailed off, leaving the 2,000 to be killed. And so we thought, well, what's all that about? And so from that moment on, Sea Shepherd took over from Greenpeace, which is kind of often the case all around the world. So I was a kind of a member of Sea Shepherd for a while. I was on the BAV committee, that's the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection. And then I formed or co-formed a lot of action groups. We had the Edelson Action Group, that's a fur company, the Hazelton Action Group, that was a vivisection laboratory, which is now called Covance, and we also had the Fur Action Group. So there was a few action groups going about. And then there was a interesting kind of relationship between the NOW, who were the first of the Animal Liberation Leagues. There's a whole series of them in the end, throughout the 1980s. Now, they were really interesting because what they would do is they would get a lot of people together at once, up to 300, but often, just 50, 60, and they would go into a place just to look at it, and to take photographs and everything. This is before the age of the internet. So it was like an expose, a little bit like an open rescue, if you like. But the interesting thing about that from an advocacy point of view is that it doesn't really matter then what the farmer says subsequently about, we treat hens this way and that way. If you've been in there, you've felt it, you've seen it, you've smelt it, and all that. And so it's very kind of useful. And then for about 8 months, I was the Northern Press Officer for the Animal Liberation Front, which didn't go too well because I got nicked after 8 months, but that's another story. So at present, I'm with the Vegan Information Project, which is based in Dublin, and it's based on vegan outreach to the public, directed at the public mainly, but also at the moment we're trying to do a lot of kind of like a mini course, which is for the advocates. So this in some way is a little bit like that. I'm now kind of an academic. My MA is called the Sociology of Compromise. That's my analysis of the British animal advocacy movement, and that formed the basis of some of the material that we've been going through in Dublin in recent weeks. And then my PhD has got a very long name. In fact, that's not even the length of it. That's just the first part of it. So the socialist construction of human beings and other animals in human non-human relations. So that's where I'm at in terms of my development, if you like. And one of the things that I teach is social movement. So that's where I come in today, in a way. What I'm trying to do then, let's get rid of that, and bring up the one that we're supposed to be using. What I try to do today then is do like an informal session. I want it to be kind of fairly interactive. And what I've done is I've assumed that most people here are either involved in animal advocacy or are interested in it. And so in that sense, we're doing that. The plan, if you like, is to run through a few basic sociological themes which are relevant. and it's relevant to the processes of socialization. These are relevant to social movement activity. And so what we're effectively going to do is run through those themes and then revisit them, hopefully interactively, if you like. Okay, so as I said, there are different types of socialization. It's a core concept in sociology. You've got primary socialization when you're children. That's very basic stuff. Even things like how to go to the toilet and use a knife and fork. You know, we need to be taught that. One interesting thing about human inference is that we're helpless when we're born, you know, and but we learn really quick, you know. So we need to be taught things, and usually that's done by the family, and traditionally it's done by the mother. So that's primary socialization within the family unit. And then you move to something called secondary socialization, which is much more complicated because that's when the media gets involved, that's when the teachers get involved, that's when you get a peer group because you go to school and this kind of thing. So that's far more kind of complicated. In some senses, what we'll be concentrating on is the first one, primary, because this is where we lay down our fundamental norms and values. And it's those fundamental norms and values that we, as animal advocates, we kind of come across and against all the time. You know, so when somebody comes up to you in the street and say all those terrible things that they often do, you know, well, God said we could, and they don't feel anything anyway, and all that. These are the values that we get taught when we're really young, you know, and it's quite interesting because there's then a process that you've got to go through to kind of overcome your initial social learning, which is what socialization is. Sometimes when I do this presentation or a presentation like this, and if it's members of the public, as it were, I will give them a blank piece of paper and I'd ask them to please draw a farmyard scene. Please draw a farm. And it's amazing because they usually draw, not as good as this, but they normally draw something like this, right? And of course we immediately recognise that these are the kind of things that we saw as children, even the kind of read with your parent type books, yeah? And it's really interesting because no matter how many times you do it, these are the pictures that you get back. So you've got the typical farmyard, when you've got the mother animals with their children, you've got homes, there's not a cage in sight, and there's no suggestion of slaughter, there's no suggestion of anything nasty going on in these situations. There's another kind of example of that. There's also quite often a social contract implied with these things because everybody cooperates, you know, and normally what happens is the farmer has a social contract with the other animals and says things like, I look after you and you produce things for me. And there was one book that I looked at where it said that in exchange for being cared for, the cows let their milk down for the farmer, you know, so they can keep it up, you know. So that's quite an interesting thing. Now, because this is socialization, this is an interesting slide, because there is a company that provides these massive kind of stickers that you put on the wall. If you see there's a child in a cot, right? And so we are talking about a time when children are very young, and in other words, these are the first lessons that we get about what we are as human beings in relation to what other animals are like. It's quite an interesting one. And just finally, there's another kind of scene. As I said, this company will provide all kinds of things like this. So children, infants, will be growing up with these images around them. Does it last? Well, yes, because again, as adults, if you ask people to draw a farmyard scene, this is what they draw. Now, they don't draw anything else because this is their image, you know. And so a lot of people who have had experience of being on the streets of Dublin campaigning will know that one of the most frequent things that happen is the public come up and go, oh, that doesn't happen in Ireland. Yeah, they say that all the time, you know. That just doesn't happen, you know. And they've got this picture in their mind, you know. Or it's all grass-fed in Ireland, or it's all free-range in Ireland, you know. This kind of stuff. It's quite interesting. Okay, so let's turn to sociology proper then. So I just think we'll go through a few slides, and as campaigners, I think you'll see the relevance of these. And then obviously we'll come back to them in an interactive sense. If you want to just say anything at any time, please do so. That's not a problem. So in general terms then, sociology is the study of human society, and it's the study of human behaviour. And it looks at, in these processes of socialisation, how human beings become social actors. Now that's an interesting thing, because sometimes we call it social agents, and in the social movement context, we're looking for moral agents. It's very important for people to grow up to be moral agents, in other words, to have a good idea of what ethically is right and wrong. We need that for society, but obviously, from our point of view in the animal advocacy movement, it's very important that we're trying to appeal to people's morality when it comes to other animals. And so, generally speaking, we're talking about human beings learning their culture, really. They learn the social rules. They learn the norms, what is normal, what isn't normal. They learn the values, and they learn the culture. Now, when you're teaching a child, you're teaching them values and attitudes, but at the same time, the classic thing that's used in sociology, where you get a situation where you see a difference between a conversation, and stereotypically it's supposed to be, one example is working class and another example is middle class, where you get the working class person being interrupted on the phone by the child, and they go, shut up, Norman, go away. I'm on the phone, right? And then the middle class parent is supposed to go, well, look, Norman, I'm on the phone to your auntie, and she can't hear me, so if you just going to be quiet for a minute, then I'll tell you all about the concept, so they kind of explain why they should do something as well as just do something, So we infuse things with values, so we tell our children what to do. We also tell them why they should. Don't steal toys from other children. Why? Because stealing is wrong. So we start to build them up into a kind of moral thing straight away. Now, the last word there is culture, and the society, amongst other things, is speciesist. So, from the animal advocacy point of view, our main problem, our main target, if you like, is cultural speciesism. Now, speciesism is everywhere. We can't not experience speciesism on a day-to-day basis. It's just everywhere, okay? Now, there is one technical note to note, I think, which is that sociologists tend to use the term speciesism in a rather wider sense that a lot of other people did, including the originators of the term. So, a lot of people think that Peter Singer was the originator of the term speciesism, but actually he just popularized it. The person who came up with it, coined it, was called Richard Ryder. Yeah. But this is what a sociologist says. This is David Nybert, his book called Human Rights, Animal Rights. Animal Rights, Human Rights, the way around. And he talks about the entanglement of the oppression of both of these groups and the liberation of these groups. But he says, speciesism is an ideology. That is, a set of widely held, socially shared beliefs. As we'll see, speciesism, like racism, sexism, and classism, results from and supports oppressive social arrangements. What he's really saying there, and what a sociologist will say to you, is that speciesism is not embedded in individual nasty people. It's in our very culture. We kind of almost like breathe it in all the time. And in some senses, we are taught speciesism. And going back to the title of the talk, that we're growing up as animal lovers who won't harm animals, well, that brings in the ideology of animal welfarism. So we've got a couple of ideologies to think about during the evening. The ideology of speciesism and the ideology of animal welfarism, which effectively says that non-cruel use is feasible and possible. That's its kind of, the welfarist promise is that we can use other animals in an ethically okay way. So the big difference between animal welfare and animal rights, the welfare is about treatment, rights is about use. That's usually the way that we talk about it. Okay, so let's put a bit of flesh on this then. We are social animals, and as social animals, Bauman notes that human beings live in the company of other people, in groups in which we interactively understand that we are greatly dependent on each other. And he immediately says, that's a rather banal thing to say. He says, to say that we live that to live is to live with others, is obvious to the point of banality. And yet, it's the fact that it is a banal statement that gives it sociological power, if you like. It means that we don't really need to think about it. It just is. It just is what happens, and that's the way we understand things. And as we'll see as we go through the evening, we also think about that in terms of human and non-human relations. Often people say, well, that's just the way it is, you know. Or, you know, that classic kind of moral schizophrenia idea that there's an issue about, well, why do you pet one set of animals and why do you eat another set of animals? The sociological answer to that is quite simple. It's because that's their function. You know, in other words, we breed some to be petted and to be ornaments and, you know, living toys, and others are bred to be meat. And so it's no contradiction for a speciesist to use them differently. It's because they're using them in correspondence with what their use is, you know, in terms of the culture. So that's an interesting kind of point in that sense. Okay, so sociology then is about investigating how we are locked together, essentially, in society, and locked in a web of mutual dependency now. One way we can think about that is just in our family, a kind of micro view about our family, that we're all interlinked, and that we all rely on each other, we all do things for the family, etc., or children are supposed to do things for the family in the future, that kind of thing. And so, you've got that kind of social relationship, and you've got mutual dependency. In a more wider social sense, we're dependent on lots of people all the time. The people who drive buses for us and everything else. And many of the people that we're interdependent with, we'll never meet, we'll never know. For example, who's creating this electricity that we're using right now? We've got absolutely no idea. Okay? But what they're doing is really useful. Yeah. This idea is that somewhere down the line, we're going to produce things for society which they can then use. So it's mutual dependency. We are locked in society together. So, living amongst others is to live in these manifold webs of human interdependency, and they have important effects on our motivations and about our social behaviour. In other words, we don't really do anything as isolated individuals. We do it as social animals. And so therefore, what we do in society means that other people take notice of it. And we care about what they say about what we're doing. And that's just the way it is for social animals. One important product of this interdependency is something sociology has a very special relationship with, which is called common sense, or common sense knowledge. It's a very important thing, but it also does things for society. So apart from a consideration of the special relationship between common sense and sociology, Bauman, who is a well-known sociologist from Yates, regards common sense knowledge and common sense understandings as powerful social mechanisms, and they fundamentally shape our attitudes about the world in which we live. So we've all got ideas about what's going on, but these are taught ideas. They're infused with social values. The apparent power of common sense emerges from the general immunity that it has to be seriously questioned. It has an effective capacity to have a kind of element of self-confirmation about it. Common sense understandings are maintained, says Bauman, through repetition of the routine, the enactment of the monotonous nature of everyday life. That enactment has two characteristics. It informs our common sense. We're doing things all the time, and it's also informed by our common sense. So we know we're on the right track because we're just doing what we always do, and more than that, what everybody else is doing. There's a kind of safety in numbers element to this, just as there is in morality. Bauman adds this: as long as we go through the routine and habitualize motions which fill most of our daily business, we do not need much self-scrutiny and self-analysis. When repeated often enough, things tend to become familiar, and familiar things are self-explanatory. They present no problems and arouse no curiosity. in a way, they remain invisible. So, picture the scene that you probably all experienced this as individuals, that the very presence of a vegan or a vegetarian in certain social settings is upsetting for other people, right? And that's because of this. Because they're doing things which are totally familiar, totally normal, they've always done it, they think it's grand, nothing's a problem, and then suddenly there's a bloody vegetarian in the house. And that, in some senses, brings forward lots of things that we culturally and individually push back. Human beings are very good at denial. There is something we can do with knowledge, which is like not know it. There are lots of cases about this, even very serious cases, like, for example, women would hold their daughters down to be raped by their fathers and then not know it. They'd forget afterwards. Right? We've got very powerful defense mechanisms going on. There's some really kind of powerful things that go on in there. So repetition is important, and when it talks about routine, you've got to understand that sociologically routine is very important as well. In fact, if most of the time, for most of the day, we know exactly what's happening in general terms, we've got a good idea when we interact with everybody or with machinery, whatever, exactly what's going to happen. If it wasn't the case, living would be terrifying. If, for example, you had no idea what somebody that you're about to kind of pass or meet was going to do, it would be absolutely terrifying. Okay, we've got a pretty good idea. Because we're social animals, we know what's going on, and we expect other people to react, roughly speaking, in a way that makes sense to us. Because we're social animals, we know how to behave. We know how to follow social rules. We follow social rules all the time. In other words, sociologically, most people are conformists. Yeah? But that's good for society in the sense of function. You've conformed by, I don't see anybody in the nude. I don't see anybody in their party gear or swim gear, because you conform to the norms and values of coming to a place like this. I've conformed in the sense that I brought all my stuff and my notes, so I'm conforming as well. We're all conforming to create this place and this event. We're all conforming in order to do it. Now, if we didn't do that, it would be a bit crazy, If you came in here and I just suddenly started going wild, it wouldn't be what you expected, right? So, routine and conformity is good for us. So, power of social groups. It's number 12. Yes. Okay, as social beings then, humans live in groups which can assert a great hold on the individual. Bauman says that a group can make people, and this means resisting the important messages of the group can be a relatively hard thing to do. Now, you'll start to see, as an animal advocate, the relevance of all this now. Effectively, it's the difference between swimming with the tide and swimming against it. And the question that challenges us is, why should people swim against the tide and give themselves loads of social pain and everything else? Because when we say go vegetarian, when we say go vegan, in some senses that's what you're doing. You're saying make life more difficult for yourself. Right? And so one question we've got to ask is, why would we do that? So abiding by and not challenging might be the best thing to do, because it's the easiest thing to do. Human beings are often looking for the easiest thing to do, the easiest pathway. He says then that changing the individual, which the group has made, can require the utmost exertion. Therefore, abiding by is much the best thing. He says that change would require much more effort, self-sacrifice, determination and endurance than are normally needed for living placidly and obediently in conformity with the upbringing offered by the group into which one is born. So just look at the power of the language here. Most people, in general terms, when we're just following the norms and values of society and fitting in, when we're fitting in, we're living in this way. We're placid, we're following the rules, we're obedient to the rules, to the law, we're conformists. And then someone from the social movement comes along and says, that's not a good idea, we want you to change completely. And then they're faced with the problems. Bauman goes on, the contrast between the ease of swimming with the stream and the difficulty of changing sides is the secret of that hold which my natural group has over me. Again, another powerful statement about the grip that society has on people. It is a secret of my dependence on my group. If I look closely and try to write down an inventory of all those things I owe to the group, to which I, for better or worse, belong, I will end up with quite a long list. Now, there's one caveat to be had here. This is not saying that no one can change, because we're proof that we can. What this is saying is that for some people in particular, change is very hard and painful and can take a long time, and there are substantial social barriers to change quite often, which is one thing that we've got to find a way around in terms of being animal advocates. So from this standard sociological starting point, that the socialization process is an ongoing phenomenon, it's not limited to childhood, Bauman suggests that later socialization can be regarded as, he calls it, the dialectics of freedom and dependence. The dialectics of freedom and dependence. They start at birth and they end at death. Now, it's a bit of a mouthful, it's just a fancy way of saying, effectively, that sociologically we are free and unfree at the same time. If you're looking for a quintessential sociological statement, it's that we, all the time, are free and unfree. There's lots of things that we can do, we have freedom to do, but they're usually within an arena which is controlled, the structure of society. So we're free and unfree at the same time. We have some social freedoms, of course, but we're always constrained by society. The idea then is that there is a struggle between these two all the time. That's the dialectics bit. There are two important things to note here. In early socialization, the child appears to have very little opportunity in terms of challenging the content of what she learns early on in her primary socialization. And perhaps an even smaller sense of freedom, of choice. She can't decide, for example, which group that she will ultimately depend on in that very early time. Thus, Bauman argues that very young children effectively have no choice about family, locality, neighbourhood, their social class, or their country. These things are not in the power of young children. We are born when we're born, we're taken when we're taken by our parents, etc., etc. We often will be imbued with the values of the class of our parents, etc., etc., etc. Now, this is not just a one-way street, don't get me wrong. It's just that we're just kind of teasing out the power here. The older one gets, and this is where we start to get some good news, then the choices that one makes can be wider. And Bauman argues that at last, some dependencies now can be challenged, and some can be rejected, while others can be actively sought. We actually are attracted to other things now, and we try to voluntarily assume them. Okay, so we are beginning to see that we do have some choices, and we can push back, if you like, but we're never entirely liberated from what we learn in our past, and in some senses, some of our core values will resurface very quickly. And again, if you've been on the street campaigning and you try and scratch under the surface of what somebody says, what God said or whatever, and we'd die if we didn't eat meat and all those kind of things. If you try and scratch under the surface of that, there's usually either nothing much there, or they'll just go back to core values, kind of, well, my mum said, or, you'll get a lot of interesting stuff. If you really kind of probe people's beliefs, you'll find, distressingly really, that there's often not much underneath. It's all on the surface. You scratch there, and you'll find there's nothing much backing it up. Okay, as suggested then, perhaps the most frequent experience of social life is that of being free and unfree at the same time. Furthermore, while some changes may seem to be attractive, in practice some of those changes may be impossible to bring about. In respect to those changes which are actually possible, Bauman reminds us that even then, the change or the cost of change can be high and rather off-putting. So here then we've got a suggestion and an argument that some social habits become so firmly fixed that the expense of change may appear to be just too much to take on. There appears to be just a little bit too much to de-learn. We have a lot of established habits that we don't want to forget. They need to be forgot, but we don't want to do it, or it's difficult to do it. Therefore, as we age, making the break becomes possible. At the same time, it might seem impossible to us because we're stuck in our ways. It might seem unlikely. And so people do talk about a generation thing. Let's try and get to the children, because they're not fixed in their ways by now. And change, for some, will appear to be unattractive. Now this is one of the final ones, really, of this kind of general sociological stuff. And it's just another kind of quintessential sociological statement that I wanted just to make sure that we're engaging here. And Bauman says that the central question of sociology, one could say, is in what way, in what sense does it matter that in whatever they do or may do, people are dependent on other people? In what sense does it matter that they always and cannot but live in the company of, in communication with, in an exchange with, in competition with, in cooperation with other human beings? So again, this is another kind of suggestion about how entangled we are with other people. And for a lot of people, that matters to them. I was at Luxembourg last year for the Animal Rights Conference, and an old friend of mine called Brendan McNally, he was saying, look, it's okay, even if your parents and your family, they meet, they go hunting, they support vivisection, it's still okay to love them, because they are your family, because some people feel the need to kind of completely make a break from that, and that's why you often get this issue of, vegan communities almost, who will only interact with other vegans virtually unless they can kind of help it, that kind of thing. It's very difficult to do if you want to lead any kind of, if you like, normal life. So, what sociology can do for us, it can offer a different way of thinking about society. And in particular, it does these two things, the first of which is the important thing for us tonight, which is identify the social in the individual and identify the general in the particular. And so that last one means that sociology has this ability to slide from the micro to the macro and back again, to analyze things. So you can look at a family or some social interaction and then look back at society in general in an abstract way. In terms of the first one, when we meet individuals, they've got all the baggage of their society with them when we meet them. What we learn as children, the attitudes that we are taught, may always be with us. We might want to change, but shaking off the past can be quite hard. Now, social movements, obviously, are often about bringing about change. So we want to do something which this is saying is quite difficult. Being in a social movement is about bringing about societal change. Or we want to change parts of it. Some social movements change all of it. We want a revolution. Some people just want to change part of it. Being in a social movement also changes us. The people in social movements change. And that means sometimes they can change so much that they have difficulty talking to what they now regard as conventional, orthodox abusers, whatever, because they have changed so much that they've kind of left the rest of society behind, if you like. So, social movements transform us. The idea about social movements is that we are looking for transformation of society, but they transform us as well. In some senses, the key to it is to understand that this complex situation is what's with us while we campaign. While we try to talk to other social animals, human beings, in terms of our values, we've got to understand that they're bringing a whole lot of their own values with them, which contradict what we say, even if there's not much behind it. And then, from our point of view, we also need to realise that there is that safety in numbers issue. You know, I've been on many a public forum, discussing this, that, and the other, politics.ie, for example. And people can write things there in defence of animal use, and they literally make no sense. And yet, a lot of people pile in and go, "I agree with John. I think what he says is right." And you're thinking, that doesn't make any sense. It's the fact that there's a safety in numbers thing there, which they're relying on. Okay, so this is the more interactive bit, if you like. I'd like some kind of comments, if you will, because we're going back, really, in terms of what was said. This is kind of like the least of the interesting things for us. But we've got this manifold webs of interdependency. So we have to realise that, the people that we're trying to influence are going to be people who are experiencing this just as we are. And one mistake that animal advocates seem to make, especially those who find changing easy, is they often expect other people to be able to change just as easily as they did. And you can often hear that on Facebook or wherever. Well, I changed, so everybody else can change, I did this, get a backbone, what's the matter with you, and all this kind of stuff. And in some senses, they're kind of ignoring the fact that other people are finding this change and this embeddedness into their own social norms and their own families and their own communities, etc. They're finding it quite difficult to do. And it's no kind of mistake, really, sociologically, to understand that usually the biggest animal rights groups are in urban places rather than rural places, and larger places rather than small places, because it's those smaller places which have got an even harder hold on people than elsewhere. Let's move on to the next one, see what we can make of that. Okay, so this is the repetition thing. Now, I'm just wondering whether you've experienced this idea, because when we go up to people and suggest that they are doing wrong, we're suggesting that they've been making moral errors for years, and that just because their family say it's okay, just because all their friends are doing it, and just because it's advertised on TV every night, and you can see it in every Hollywood film or whatever, it's still wrong. We're challenging something, and they can use all of what they know about that issue against us, because we're saying, well, look, we're all doing it, safety in numbers. Anybody experienced that? I mean, I certainly have. Yeah. Anybody got any examples? People said things. I mean, we did a page of view, and Irina here found one person very kind of challenging, because he reckoned he worked in a slaughterhouse for a time. And it's interesting because, again, this thing about not having to make sense is he contradicted himself, but it didn't matter to him that he had, and we didn't even get a chance to say. Because at one point he says, well, we're not that cruel anymore in Ireland. In fact, we're quite gentle the way that we kill animals now. And then, within about 2 minutes, he was saying, well, animals don't feel pain. In fact, you can stand on it, and it won't feel pain, And so that begs the question, well, why suddenly has the system got all gentle then? It didn't matter that he was contradicting himself, because normally that value would never be challenged. And we see that, which is why people come up sometimes, and they are quite taken aback. You know, I mean, I don't know, and I think a lot of people here have had experience of being on the streets with people, and some people can be quite taken aback. And what they will often do as a defence mechanism is be quite dismissive. Oh, I'm not listening to that rubbish, you know. And one great thing for them, especially if you're on a stand or a stall, is that they can walk away, you know. And so when they start losing the argument, or they're kind of losing, you know, it's get a bit shaky, you know, the foundational thoughts are starting to be challenged, they think, oh, I'm not having any of this, and they'll walk away, you know. And then the only thing that we can hope for is that we've planted a few seeds, you know, and that's the way it is. So this thing here is that when we're familiar with things like eating meat and, you know, using L'Oreal or whatever, then there's no problem. Everybody else is doing it. What's the problem? You know, if there was some problem, something would be done about it. You know, the government would do something about it. And there's one issue, which is really kind of an ironic one, where the animal welfare groups, like the ISPCA, are kind of used within this construct to suggest to people that what they're doing is okay. So I'll tell you how it works. ISPCA is to prevent cruelty to animals, right? So what people do when they're in the supermarket, they pick up a piece of meat in their foam thing and they put it into their bag, and they know there's no cruelty in that piece of meat. Why? Because the ISPCA exists, and their job is to prevent cruelty to animals. So if there was any cruelty to animals, then that wouldn't have been on the shelf in the first place. That's what they can tell themselves. You know, it's quite a usual thing. But also, that's even if they even question themselves in the first place. You know, so not only have they got that first thing about there's no problem here, they've got that second thing about, well, I know that because, you know, the groups would have done something about it, or the government would have done something about it. All right, a couple more. This idea of the group making people and the idea of changing. So we must have all known people who say things like, I'm sympathetic to you, but I can't change. You know, I can't do it. And there's quite an interesting thing in the vegan movement now about vegetarians who often say that about cheese. Cheese seems to be the big thing. So there's a lot of discussion about the idea that cheese is addictive, you know, because of this casomorphine in it, which is like a chemical compound which effectively adheres the infant to the mother. And because cheese is such an unusual product, what you've got is concentrated calf food. I always call milk calf food because that's what it is. So you've got concentrated calf food, and you eat it in a big block, so you get a lot of that into you, according to some people. And that means that cheese itself can be quite addictive, you know. But I've known people for years and years and years saying, you know, it's just too hard, I can't do what you do, or what you've done. Which is often why, another distressing thing for me, I think, is that when people say, oh, you're so brave, or you must be so strong, you know, and that is such a useful thing for them to say. It's kind of like, yeah,
you're so disciplined.
You're disciplined, yeah, kind of like, you know. But they're saying, that's great for you because you're strong. I'm weak, I can't do that. I'm off to McDonald's. So it's a very, socially, that's a really kind of convenient thing to give somebody else that compliment. Oh, you're so strong, you know. You've got such self-discipline that you can be vegan, you know. You know, might be a mad idea, but you could do it because you're so strong. And then, of course, the negative version of that is, well, you can do that because you're so fanatical and you're such an extremist, you know. And that's another way of pushing people away, you know. And so we've got all these kind of defense mechanisms which we use all the time. There's a whole kind of series of them, you know. And this is, I think it's, in some senses, when I give this talk, people think this is a bit depressing because it's suggesting that our job is very hard. Well, I think there's some truth in that. It's not just a question of giving somebody a leaflet and that's it. You know, Although, of course, we all know people who say, well, I got a leaflet off somebody, and bingo, I was a vegan next day, right? It tends not to happen with most people, as we know. In fact, leaflets are interesting because most of them end up on the floor and stuff like that now. But the fact is that because we've done it doesn't mean that a lot of people will do it. They've got all these social mechanisms, and they're all conformists. And then this is that question that we need to ask ourselves. We've got a leaflet, and you hand it to somebody. Why should they take it?
Because it would be rude to just say keep it.
No, but for what reason? I mean, like, I made this point in my PhD. If people think about animal suffering and slaughterhouses, as Rossby says, houses of slaughter, for a nanosecond, they're going to think, there's probably going to be a lot about that I don't like. I certainly don't want to read about it, I don't want to see it, I don't want to watch a film about it. There's probably going to be a lot about that that's going to make me it's going to make me feel uncomfortable. And here's somebody giving me that knowledge and going, go on, take this pain, go on, take this pain. So, in that kind of social psychology, we've got to ask ourselves, what induces them to take it, Now, obviously, you can get grander ideas, like, for example, one citizen giving another citizen a leaflet is one of the basics of democracy. So they should take it for that reason, But don't get me started on those chuggers people, who completely wrecked that entire system, It's like, people now, in the 1980s, people used to come up to us to get a leaflet, Now, you try and give people a leaflet, it's almost like, what explosives in that, what kind of poison's embedded into that thing? Because they're expecting you to try and sign them up to, to Amnesty International or something, or concern. So they think that you want their money, But going back to this then, we are really, socially, saying that, swim against the tide, And in some senses, the people in this room have done that. To various degrees, we've done that. We've broken free of that, and we are swimming the other way to some degree. And don't be surprised if there's elements of uncomfortableness about it. Particularly, and this is the sociological point, particularly if the people that are most unreceptive are your family. A lot of people, I see this on Facebook all the time. I can't get through to my family. My family won't listen to me. Blah, 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 and all this kind of stuff. And it really distresses them. Now, interestingly, sociologically, that's kind of to be expected. In some senses, talking to them might be the hardest people to talk to. Because when a stranger comes to you and go, oh, I've got an argument, what do you think of this? You're just listening to the argument. When a family member does it, you've got all the family baggage and everything with it, and all the rest for years and years and years. So that changes the fact that you're not just receiving information. So sometimes, it's not that the family member won't change or anything, it's often the fact that, in some sense, it's the wrong person trying to interact with them. Sometimes a stranger will be better doing it than that. So the cost is off-putting. And then I think this might be the final one. This is our slide of hope, I call this. Our slide of hope, which is that it is true that we're very locked down when we're in primary socialization. We don't have much control of our lives. We're in our little families and everything. But then, very quickly, things do change, and you do start to meet other people, and our choices do become wider, and then, we can, depending if we're willing to pay the cost, we can make change. And that is an interesting thing, because I've written a blog entry which is called A Numbers Game. We are still in the pioneer stage of veganism. So we now, our generation of vegans can still regard themselves as pioneers. We're still in the pioneer stage. We're 1-2% of the population at the most. And then, if you want, you can then start splitting them up, ethical vegans, all that kind of stuff. And then there's the argument about if you're not an ethical vegan, you're not vegan, it gets a bit complicated. But, so it's a numbers game. Our job, I think, is that if we build the foundation of veganism as a social movement and make it the moral baseline of the animal rights movement, then we're building a strong foundation for the vegans who will come in after us. And the better that we build the foundation, the easier it is for them to erect the structure on top of it. And the more slapdash we are at it at this stage, the more work those people who follow us have to do. And I tend to think of it as that way. So, people can change. And when the numbers grow, then change will be easier and easier and easier until it gets to the stage where it's the norm. I mean, that's the idea. A vegan world would be that veganism is the norm. It will take that build-up. If you think about the number of plant-based foods that we've got available to us now, even in Ireland, I know that the range of things in Ireland is not as good as elsewhere, but even in Ireland, especially places like Dublin and the cities and everything, it's quite big when you think about it, and they're catering to a very minute percentage of the population. If that got to 2, 3, 4, and then they started to think there's some incentive here to do some research and development, R&D, you can just imagine the explosion of vegan stuff that would come. So that's why it's a numbers game. So that's why if people are pessimistic or thinking we're still small, nothing's changing, and most people I know, are not getting it and all that, we still have to believe that there are vegans out there, and we need to hope that there is enough of them to make some substantial change. So we're all vegan pioneers. And so if you want to read about that, there's I've got a blog site, and it's called Hello Donald. In other words, we're all Donald Watson. Okay, does anyone want to say anything so I don't have to keep chuntering at you?
I would like to say something. Because it might also give everyone hope. I'm not a vegan yet. This made me consider it very much, actually, but that was not the point.
It's my point.
Yes.
I do mine when I came, actually.
So what I was going to say is, even on not being a vegan, I don't eat much meat, milk, any of that. And even just by living that way, I'm infecting my friends. I don't even talk to them, but they start to cook vegetarian meals and think about how much milk they use. And it's really nice because I'm not even promoting it, that's all. So that just by living your life, you already change the world. And I think that's a fantastic thing.
Yeah, it's interesting that. I mean, I wonder. I mean, I know the answer to this from one person very much, but in terms of, do you think just being a vegan or a vegetarian is actually campaigning?
Yeah.
In some way, it's not enough. But it starts. I think in some ways with our family and neighbors, it's more efficient than trying to convert people.
Because they ask you questions and then you answer.
No, it's just like she said, just by being a vegan and being there, they start to think about that, and it's more efficient than going toward them and
so how do they find out they're a vegan in the first place? How do they find out? I mean, people know because I was around this.
Yeah, well, with the family, at first we had to explain just a bit, of course. But then, once they are used to, it's not by telling them, "Oh, you're doing wrong. You should eat less cheese. You should eat less. See how I'm healthy, etc." It's more efficient just to act. They see by themselves without the need to say them. You see what I mean?
Yeah. But it's interesting, guys. I know for a fact that Bernie is sat behind you there. It's kind of like she sees it the other way around, don't you? That veganism just comes from campaigning. That's how you see it, isn't it?
Well, I feel you can go vegan. Well, back in the 80s when I went vegan, I sort of went vegan and I was vegan, but mainly the campaign was against the separate issues. Like I sort of still do, I suppose. But now, veganism is as much of an issue as all the other issues together. I know I separate them, and I know you don't. We don't really see eye to eye on this. I see the real campaigning as helping the animals right now by trying to change some of the legislation, some of the atrocities that are going on. Whereas Roger sees the issue as, let's even get one vegan this month, and that vegan won't do any harm, And that's nearly more productive than the other way of campaigning. But I think we need both.
Yeah.
I think going vegan is not enough. You know, I get into trouble for saying that, but I sort of feel going vegan is not enough. You have to do more than that. Get out with the placards, get out and save animals.
But,
now.
it's interesting. I mean, I'm always interested in your perspective because it's as though.
Because you can't
there's-
shut me up.
No, there is that. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, you do know my phone number, which was a mistake. But there are a percentage of vegans who become vegan, and then they don't campaign in your eyes, right, or your thing. And then, but veganism itself doesn't preclude people campaigning, which is the odd bit. It's as though you're almost like expecting a certain percentage of them to say, "Okay, I'm doing my bit now. That's it." And so.
Well, you see, I suppose a certain percentage of us older campaigners, I hate to say the word older, but we're not teenagers anymore, but a certain percentage of us, like probably Brendan McNally that you mentioned earlier, I know Brendan, he would feel, get out there on the streets and sort of, there's so much stuff going on, like the abuse of horses or the turkeys on the turkey farms, all the things that are going on just right now. They need to be addressed because you can't ignore them. That's more the reason. They're so bad you can't ignore them.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I think that campaigning for veganism is not ignoring anyone in that sense. But I take.
Well, we feel there's an awful lot of bun eating. Like, I don't go for the bun eating, right? That's
Yeah.
all meat up and eat
Well,
buns.
I think
You
that's
know,
I think that's
vegan
really
buns.
one of the reasons that the VIP was formed
Yeah.
is because our focus is the public, and the idea is to get out there in people's faces with the vegan message. And the interesting thing is that until very recently, I mean, this idea that veganism is now the moral baseline of the animal rights movement, now it's quite controversial because it never was fully accepted, and there are some influential people who are kind of sliding back from that now, that people like Melanie Joy and stuff. So that idea, has not been taken on, but there's some of the worries about campaigning for veganism is the fact that people are scared of the name. So we kind of wanted to test that out with VIP. We had a 16-week residency in Temple Bar. We had a stall there all day on a Wednesday for 16 weeks with massive vegan signs: Vegan Information Day, Why Vegan, Vegan Information Project. It wasn't a question of sign this petition to save the whales, and then you sneak them at a vegan leaflet. And it was very kind of open, because in some sense we wanted to kind of test that hypothesis that veganism is a scare word even in a place like Ireland, and we didn't find it at all, did we? We found very many people open to it. I call them vegan curious, and people are doing that, and we're now starting to get lots of reports about people who wear these kind of things and vegan badges and everything, that people are kind of coming up to them, asking them questions about it because they see the word, and they also are kind of quite curious about it, So I think you can marry the two. Obviously, I mean, I'm a vegan campaigner, I think, as opposed to just a vegan advocate.
Well, I think so, yeah. I mean, I never made any secret about veganism. Always on radio and all the rest of it. I was asked, they knew out straight what I was. But a lot of people do. Like Lula on Prime Time took the welfare stance to
Is there anybody who thinks that's a good tactic to actually not
lie.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's one of the things that I agree with Yoski about. Is that I'm not a politician, and I think it's difficult. Like there was one guy gave a lecture this year's Luxembourg thing, and he was saying, effectively, you don't have to tell people the truth, because you are not the audience. So in other words, you can do this kind of Nick Cooney thing, the foot in the door thing, and it's almost like, oh no, we don't want you to go vegan. It's just meat-free Monday kind of thing. But really, you do want them to go vegan. It's just that you're not going to tell them that, and then you kind of let them in a little bit at a time, type of thing.
It doesn't work anymore. Years ago, it might have worked. Back in the 80s and 70s.
I just wonder if anybody thought that would be a good
now
idea.
the hunters, the vivisectors, they all know the agenda, and the agenda is really veganism.
Yeah, okay. And that's
So-
why you get that, yeah.
So it's silly to try and say, oh no, we just want to end fur, but we're not asking you to go vegan. That's silly. They can see through it now. It doesn't work.
Okay.
You have to be honest. I think.